drinks, go to the bathroom, and we'll be back at 8:10.
Alrighty. I don't have a whole lot to start you off in terms of what to do, largely because 5 years ago, if you were interested to sort of get involved in, projects, green businesses, activism on this stuff, you had to hunt pretty hard to find the places to do things on energy and global warming issues. But that's all changed. And my first couple comments about how we are now in that magical decade or so that everyone talks about. We are in the tipping point, for better or worse. So my advice actually has become very simple. It used to be you need to go to kind of a specialized degree program like Garrett and Brooke and others went to. But now it's really much more, if there's an aspect of the energy problem that is of interest to you, Google it and whatever city or area you live in, and you will now find a long list of things. And they've got all kinds of interesting forums. There are techie-based things, finding out what's going on with solar panels. Why is it, for example, that the solar panels that most people put on their roof are, you have your roof of your home, and then you put solar panels as another layer above that. You kind of, you drill holes in your roof, you put this whole other layer on top. Why isn't it the case that the shingles that we all buy are themselves solar panels? It would make a lot of sense. It would amortize the cost of solar panels into the cost of building a new roof. 5 years ago, you couldn't do it. Now, that technology is coming online. So whatever technical area you're interested in, you can find. But it's the social issues that are proving to be the hard ones. We have not yet figured out how to put a price on carbon, which is what we don't want, and make it stick. There's a European effort. There's a really minimal U.S. effort called the Chicago Climate Exchange. There's California committing to do it but hasn't done it yet. So there's discussion about the economics of carbon. And anyone with a financial background or business interests, there's huge opportunities now that didn't exist a couple years ago. And then there's the other looming issue that I predict we will either all cook in the greenhouse because we screwed up, or 50 years from now we will look back and say, oh, the climate problem wasn't so hard. It cost 20 or 50 or whatever, $100 billion a year to fix, but it was a pretty easy problem compared to the big problem out there, which I would argue is actually poverty. And we've gotten used to poverty. And poverty is something that essentially all people who are well off benefit from poverty of others in terms of labor and all kinds of things. And climate change, even though the poor are going to suffer more and suffer first from climate change, we will all eventually have our lives changed to some extent, which to my mind means we will eventually get serious about climate change. It might be soon. It might be really late so that we've lost a lot of environmental features that we like, for example, coral. But I think climate change will look back on and say, that was a serious problem, but in fact was not as hard to fix as poverty. They're all also, of course, related, because the more people want to transition to the middle class, and people talk about China generating X number of new consumers a year, that moving out of poverty and moving into a carbon-intensive lifestyle is a real problematic link. So there are all kinds of groups out there that are now finally organized around the poverty, environmental justice linkage. The Ella Baker Center in London, in Oakland, the Latino Issues Forum. There's a whole variety of groups out there, a long, long list, looking at the climate, environment, energy linkages, and that's a huge area. I've already sort of highlighted that there are features, in my opinion, to like and to strongly dislike about both biofuels and nuclear, both of which have very active groups advocating on either side. At Berkeley, there's a group of students and faculty called the Stop BP, Stop This Deal with BP, because they don't want to see a major public university having such a large contract with a carbon oil based company. I happen to think that's wrong, but I certainly understand the argument against. And all of these are areas where a little bit of Google searching will put you in touch. And since there's people in the room that work with some of the groups, so I don't know if Brooke and Garrett, you want to say just sort of 30 seconds about what ICLEI does as an example of a group looking at this?
Sure. Garrett Fitzgerald, North Allegheny High School.
Now that was uncalled for, by the way.
Randomly, there are 4 of us from high school that have not seen each other since in over 10 years in the room tonight, which is also nice. Brooke Lee and I, Garrett Fitzgerald, we work for an organization called ICLEI Local Governments for Sustainability. We're a membership-based association of city and county governments that decided that climate change is a big deal and they want to do something about it. We help them figure out their contribution to global warming and figure out what they can do to meet whatever reduction target that they're setting. So we provide tools and technical assistance and these kinds of things. We actually, a little known story, Dan, I don't know if you even heard the Texas coal power plant story that you told earlier. This actually started when we got together a group of mayors in the state of Texas that are interested in climate change, doing climate protection work in their cities. We put them together in a room just to say, let's share some stories and see what happens. Tried to get Laura Miller, the former mayor of Dallas, in the room, and she said, you know, what will make it worth it for me to show up to this little event, networking event for other mayors? I've got a lot to do with the mayor of the biggest city in Texas. And we said, just come, put a proposal out there. We're going to get all the rest of the mayors in the room. So she comes and they're talking about what are we doing to save energy in our buildings and try to do better public transit in our cities. And Mayor Miller, when it's her turn, throws a check down on the table and says, I want to stop the coal power plants. So if you guys all come together and do this with us, everybody throw in some money, we'll hire out the law firms, we'll get the NRDCs involved, we'll get all the other organizations involved, and actually make this a real political issue in Texas. I think we can do it. And it was actually in a little ICLEI meeting where all of that stuff started. So that we're essentially a group that helps give cities the advice that they need to try to figure out how they can take action on climate change, and really provides a lot of networking opportunities to help build the political momentum that's caused you now seeing Time and Newsweek and all of these magazines are talking about cities and climate change, etc.
So let me add one thing to that, and that is that 10 years ago, the number of interesting new ideas for how to bring down carbon emissions was pretty thin. There was lots of interesting stories in sort of my big introductory energy class, but not a whole lot of theory. Suddenly, there's all these neat new ideas about how to do it. I mentioned this low carbon fuel standard, maybe at too much length for some of you, but this is an idea that didn't exist a couple years ago as a way just to think about our liquid fuels. Popped up, people said, let's try it, and it went incredibly fast from literally a spreadsheet a few of us had we were playing with to the law of the state that leads these things in the country, California. There's a whole bunch of these things going on. The city of Berkeley passed Measure G, which calls for them to get off of carbon entirely, except for the vehicles that pass through the city. They're giving themselves a little loophole for that on I-80, turns out. But city of Berkeley figured out in a meeting not too different than what Garrett's talking about, a totally obvious when you say it, but revolutionary way to think about solving the biggest problem of photovoltaics, of solar panels. So, you all, I assume, have one of these, and the few of you who don't, I'm sure, are proud of it. But how many of you would have one of these if you had to pay for all of your minutes for the next 20 years up front? Probably pretty few, right? Maybe a couple closet venture capitalists in the back, but basically none. Lots of solar panels, and contract with a local electrical union to get a good price to install them. And when you, the homeowner, or you, the set of apartment dwellers in Berkeley, decide you want to put solar on the roof, you tell us you want to do it, we contract, it comes out and gets installed, and you don't pay anything up front. It goes on the property tax of the building. So for an average home, solar panels cost about $20,000. So over the next 20 years, you're going to have an extra $1,000 hit on your bill, but suddenly the biggest problem of installing solar is gone away, just by the city aggregating and putting it on their bill up front. I kind of said, damn it, I wish I'd thought of that. I mean, that's exactly the kind of thing that no one was pondering a couple years ago, and now suddenly ideas like that are everywhere. So there are lots and lots of angles, and looking up ICLEI, looking up environmental defense, Natural Resources Defense Forum, a group called Environmental Entrepreneurs. There's a long, long list, and you can find them basically by Googling your favorite energy issue and activism, local, whatever your city is. You'll find them. It's really become very easy.
And in fact, on the website, by the end of the week, I'll post all the ones that Dan has just mentioned on our website. So it'll be very easy for you to find sciencecafesf.com and plug.
Pretty cool.
I have multiple questions. The first one relates to solar power. Is currently the policy with PG&E is that the best you can do is a zero power bill. Why wouldn't we allow the homeowners to actually get paid for the power that they supply to PG&E?
Okay, so great question. And let me just restate the numbers you said there. I have solar on my roof, and the best you can do, you're allowed to do, is you can install as many solar panels as you want on your rooftop. You can cover it, you can do whatever you want, but the best PG&E will allow you to do is to bring your electricity bill to zero, minus a small handling charge, which you can't get rid of. And what that means is that if you're going to install solar on your rooftop, it doesn't make sense for you to install enough panels to meet your peak demand. Because if you go over by 1 kilowatt hour, that's your donation to the utility. And few of us like to donate to the utility, right? It may be one of the nice utilities around. We think so now. We didn't 5 years ago. But now we're sort of mildly in love with PG&E. And so you still don't want to donate to them. And think about what this says to the industry. My roof had space for quite a few more panels on it than I installed. But I didn't install more because I couldn't bear the thought of donating all that power to PG&E. They should pay for the power, right? Even if they paid me a small amount, it would make sense to put it on. So because I, like every other person who has solar on their rooftop in California, underbuilt their system, that meant that I bought less panels than I would have, because once you install the wiring and the junction box and the AC to DC machine, once I built all the infrastructure, adding panels is pretty cheap, right? The marginal cost to add more panels is low. But I didn't because it rankles me to donate to the utility. So that's bad for the industry because that means I underinstalled. So they didn't make as much sales as they could have. So their panels didn't become cheaper because every industry sees the price of things dropping by the number you install. So this is incredibly economically inefficient to build a new industry. So we should change it. Simple as that. We haven't changed it because the utilities have fought tooth and nail against it because they don't want to lose out on the ability to generate power. Now, does anyone remember a little known fact about California? We had an energy crisis in 2001, right? That energy crisis was spurred because utilities in California no longer generate power. They had to sell their power plants. So what is it that PG&E is holding on to? They don't actually generate power, so they don't make money from that. And California has it's a bit of esoteric. But in most places, in most industries, the more you sell, the more money you make. Right? That's sort of how industry works. In the energy industry in California, so in California, utilities do not make more money based on selling more kilowatts. This is a pretty serious one. Okay. So California did something quite novel. It's called decoupling. It means that if the utility sells exactly the amount of power next year that they forecast, they get paid X amount of money. If they sell 10% more power than that, we reduce the amount of money they get paid per kilowatt hour so they make the same amount of money. If they undersell because they, for example, got you all to install efficient devices, they make the same amount of money because we then pay them more per kilowatt hour. So in California, it doesn't matter how much power you sell. Utilities know how much they're going to earn. So the fact that they keep fighting against what's called net metering, which is how much power I put back on the grid I get paid for, remains mysterious. It's largely due to just inertia. Therefore, it's probably not going to take that long to fix it. But it hasn't happened yet because all these things take a little while to go through. Great question, long answer. Once again, I apologize.
I have two more questions. First, are you Canadian?
Because of, I said out?
Yes.
I'm from upstate New York and from Palo Alto, so nope.
Okay, carbon sinks. How much merit do you give to carbon sinks, whether they're artificial or natural? I think I saw online recently a CO2 scrubber. I've heard reports of maybe we sprinkle iron filings on the oceans to increase phytoplankton production as a carbon sink.
Okay, so you had to bring it up. All right, so carbon sequestration is one of the other big things out there. And what it means is that we're going to bury carbon. And there's lots of ways to bury carbon. You can bury carbon by injecting the CO2 back underwater, underground into aquifers. So you make the underground lakes into carbonated water. That's one way to bury it somewhere. You can also take that carbon and grow trees and hope they never burn down in a forest fire, because if you grow trees, that'll absorb carbon and that'll also suck it up. And you can do things like you heard. It turns out that a number of the microorganisms in the ocean don't grow as fast as they would because there's not enough of the nutrients. And one of the nutrients is iron that they need. If you take a petri dish and put a lot of these organisms, this plankton in it, and you watch how fast they grow, if you add iron, they grow much faster. They grow faster, they absorb carbon, they die, they sink to the bottom of the ocean. You know when you watch those undersea movies and you see the white stuff kind of coming down like snow? That's carbon sinking to the bottom of the ocean. And as it gets down about 2 to 3 kilometers deep in the ocean, it's cold and dense enough that it sinks, and the carbon is denser than water, so barring a little disaster, it should stay down there. I am not a big fan of this approach. We know we're going to do a lot of this. And we're going to do a lot of it because it's the technology that requires the least change. If we could suck up all the carbon that we're emitting, suddenly coal plants are back in business. A few states, like turns out Idaho, anyone from Idaho here? Okay. Oh, Idaho, that bastion of liberalism, outlawed coal-fired power plants. Not because of global warming, but because of mercury poisoning and childhood deaths. So there are other reasons to get rid of coal aside from carbon, but carbon is the biggie. And if we could suck up as much carbon as we emitted, coal is back in business in a big, big way. So carbon sequestration is the way to make the least change to our economy and deal with the carbon problem. It's also, however, the case that the amount of carbon we're absorbing today globally through these different programs on a commercial basis is zero. There are a bunch of test facilities out there, and if the carbon doesn't leak back out, and if accelerating the life cycle of bacteria doesn't cause other problems, like the fish can't feed on. If there are no ecological surprises and there's no leakage and nothing goes wrong, it looks great. But the most basic rule of ecology I know is that tinkering with a system you don't fully understand is a bad place to go. And so personally, this is going to cause some. I would rather build nuclear than think that carbon sequestration is our big savior. Because I know what the problems of nuclear are. but I have no idea what they are for carbon sequestration. Doesn't mean we're not going to do a lot of it, but it means that it's always a worry to me when the solution to a big problem is something we know nothing about.
Well, the ocean's already absorbing a lot of carbon naturally, and they're already warming because of that, and reaching some scientific point.
Okay, so ocean chemistry. What you said is exactly right. Half of the carbon we put into the air eventually goes into the ocean. And most of that carbon, with the current way the ocean works, with cold water in the north and saltier water and these flows, it's a complicated system, that carbon eventually sinks to the bottom and sits there, we hope. But there's a couple things that are worrying about tinkering with this system. Remember I said before that humans emit about 7 billion tons of carbon into the air each year? Turns out we emit about 7. And in the air there's around 800 billion tons of carbon. But in the ocean there's 40,000 billion tons of carbon. Fuck with the ocean, and who knows what's going to happen. If the ocean suddenly absorbs a massive amount of carbon, we're in an ice age. If the ocean suddenly burps massive amount of carbon back out, we are in a greenhouse that like you never believed. In my view, don't mess with that massive amount of carbon unless you actually know what's going on, and we don't. So it is a possible thing to do to hope the oceans will absorb more, but in my opinion, it's the sort of the highest risk gamble, just because we don't understand ocean chemistry very well. So doesn't mean we're not going to propose it and someone's not going to do it. And a friend of mine, Richard Branson, is now paying for people who will find solutions like this. Branson and Gore announced the Climate Prize, $25 million to the first person who can suck up a lot of carbon. Almost all the proposals came in were for doing things to the ocean. And the number of those companies and groups that really know the full implications of that doesn't mean we won't have to do it, but we just don't know a lot about what's going to go on. So,
yeah, and let me ask you another question about biofuels again.
That topic, yeah.
Earlier on, yeah, you mentioned ethanol and you mentioned biodiesel and some other things, and so far you've actually gotten away without talking about biodiesel at all, which is pretty amazing. Given that this is a fuel that is available pretty readily now in Berkeley and San Francisco and all over the area here. There are lots of things to talk about in terms of accessibility and how do you actually start doing biodiesel and et cetera. But one of the things that we are struggling with, how do you, we hear a lot of different numbers for how to consider the greenhouse gas emissions benefits of biofuel. What is the real net benefit? Is this a zero carbon fuel, or how do you consider what the net benefit is from a greenhouse gas standpoint of biofuel?
Okay. So biodiesel is simply the diesel fuel you guys are used to, made from biological products. Nothing more complicated than that. And in fact, biodiesel looks much more like regular diesel fuel than ethanol looks like gasoline. So it's not a big transition to think about putting biodiesel in. The VW Golf and a whole variety of diesel vehicles can take biodiesel with zero modifications. Turns out, by the way, as an aside, that modifying a car that's a gasoline car to be an ethanol car is pretty trivial. $200 of gas caps and hoses. So that's not a big deal. But biodiesel is really, if you have biodiesel and you have a diesel car, put it in. Biodiesel suffers from the same pluses and minuses as ethanol does in terms of how much better than gasoline it is. If your biodiesel comes from a good sustainable supply, i.e. the plants you're growing to make the biodiesel are not being grown by dumping lots and lots of fertilizer on them, then it's a good deal. And in fact, the average biodiesel is better than the average ethanol. Remember I said ethanol is 20% better than gasoline? The average biodiesel is about 40 to 45% better than gasoline. So it's a good deal. The issue is that we still don't know the full atmospheric chemistry of the emissions from diesel. old-style diesel cars had a downside that they produced more particles in the air than a gas car. So they caused more asthma, there was more local soot problems. The new generation of clean, spark-free diesels work much better and have very, very low particulates. But they still have more particles they emit per mile driven than burning gasoline, on average. There are really good biodiesels in really good engines, but on average, it still produces a little more particles in the air than does burning gas. And one of the health crises in this country is asthma rates for kids, as probably many of you know, are rising and are at historic highs. And particles in the air from burning liquid fuels is almost certainly part of that story. So biodiesel is a good thing, but there are some trade-offs. Better for greenhouse gases, mildly worse on the particulate side, although we've done very little work on making those diesels better in the US. Europe is far ahead of us in terms of making the diesel fuel in their cars better. So mixed story, like all these.
Are they going to work on some NOx scrubber to try and clean up that particulate issue for the biodiesel?
You can. So NOx is nitrous oxide, NO or NO2, and there are ways to scrub it out. They tend to cost a little bit on the energy efficiency, but you can certainly do it.
Is that a fuel application or a vehicle?
It would be an engine modification. It has to do with the temperature of the engine, and some diesels have what's called a pre-ignition. They ignite some fuel to ignite more fuel. How you do that critically determines how much of these particles you get.
Is that available now?
I don't know, actually.
They have it for buses, but it costs almost as much as a bus. So that's what I hear.
And Brooke knows all, I have discovered, by the way. So part of the solution, I think that we came back to something that we said early on, and that is that you want to get a lot of energy from anything, whether it's a carbon-based fuel or a renewable. There are going to be impacts. And thinking that one thing is going to replace lock, stock, and barrel, gasoline or coal plants, I think is the wrong approach. It's got to be this mix. But we're still going to have impacts. And so I personally view the carbon problem as the biggest environmental problem out there we're facing right now. The water problem is certainly a close second in my view. So getting carbon out of our power plants and our vehicles, to me, is top of the list. Because it's the one that if we don't fix it, all the other problems are irrelevant because we cook. But we're going to need a lot of these, and we're going to need a lot more people doing these projects, a lot more research, which is actually why, with all of the controversy, the British Petroleum, Beyond Petroleum, BP, Berkeley deal is one that I think we critically needed to do. And the other partners that BP was considering did not have anywhere near the kind of social conscience and focus on the social questions that Berkeley does. It's actually a little bit surprising that BP didn't pick some of the other options. The other option that I thought was a real viable one was to partner not with us, a public university with a history of free speech and protest, but to partner with MIT, which has much, much less, shall we say, of such a history. And in fact, I think you have to give BP credit, because the thing that would have made the most sense if they wanted just to dominate the biofuel market wouldn't have been to partner with any university at all. They should have bought Monsanto. Just buy the damn company. BP has the money. Monsanto holds many of the patents that they'd want to get into this area. And if their goal was to dominate biofuels in the next 10 years, that would have been the winning story. And it would have been an environmental disaster. BP, to their credit, decided to partner with what I call a pretty difficult date. Berkeley is not going to be easy, but whether we succeed in being a difficult but a good date, i.e. we help them to clean the research programs and to work on good biofuels, remains to be seen.
I have a question. I'm sitting behind the pole.
Oh.
You may not be able to see me.
Now I can.
It was just a clarification of your comparison earlier of solids and liquid fuels. And you seem to suggest that electric cars, because they're not emitting any emissions on the road, basically have no emissions at all. And on the other hand, it would seem that if they're getting their electricity from a power plant, that the emissions are located at the power plant. And I was wondering if you could clarify the emissions comparison between those different fuels.
This is a great point. So, a plug-in hybrid car, and probably many of you have seen movies like Who Killed the Electric Car. A plug-in hybrid is not the old-style electric vehicle, the EV1. The reason is that just having electricity doesn't give you the flexibility to go drive to the mountains or go head off on a longer trip. The average car in this country drives less than 40 miles a day. Putting a battery in your car that will give you 40 to 60 mile range, it's not that hard. But putting a battery in your car that will give you 300 miles is very difficult. So the plug-in hybrid is a vehicle where you think about the battery and the liquid tank in reverse. In a plug-in hybrid, you run off the electric first, and then your liquid fuel, hopefully a clean biofuel, is in reserve. Take the same plug-in hybrid vehicle and charge it up in California that has one of the cleanest grids in the country, and that vehicle, instead of costing you $3 a gallon of gas equivalent, will cost you around 65 cents equivalent because of the relative cost of electricity to gasoline. And because our grid is clean relative to most of the country, because we don't have any coal in state right now, although we do burn coal out of state and import the electricity, which we have to fix. A plug-in hybrid in California is traveling around at an equivalent of about 110 to 120 miles per gallon, because our electricity is that much cleaner than our gas, the gasoline we burn. But if you take that same plug-in hybrid car and you airlift it to West Virginia, that vehicle is dirtier than gasoline because the electricity in West Virginia is largely coal, right? So exactly what you're saying is true. How clean your mix is makes sense. Now, thankfully, half of U.S. states have laws on the books requiring a certain fraction of electricity to be zero carbon, renewable. In those places, the plug-in hybrid is a much better thing for the environment than a gas car. But in Ohio, that's highly coal-based, and West Virginia and parts of Pennsylvania, that same vehicle is worse than gas. So to make the plug-in hybrid really work well, you need to green your power grid. But notice something very sinister in a good way just happened. When you start talking about this, suddenly a plug-in hybrid car allows you to link your stationary power plants and your mobile power. The biggest problem in our energy industry is that there's very little competition. Utilities are monopolies by design, and the big oil companies are oligopolies. They're small sets of people that control the price of gas, and competition is scarce. But a plug-in hybrid allows your utility to compete with BP for your driving dollar. And that opens up competition in a way that's very exciting because we haven't seen it before in this field. So competition, if the market is structured around a greener mix, is likely to actually generate lots of neat new innovations. Enter the low carbon fuel standard. Because if we say your liquid fuel has to be clean, and electricity is clean relative to burning gasoline, suddenly your utility is in a better place to sell you driving services than is Chevron or BP. For Chevron or BP to compete, they're going to have to green their fuel mix. That's going to make the utilities want to find ways to do more of the same. That's a really healthy starting ground. And there's one last piece of the story about plug-ins, which is interesting, and that is that at night, we underuse our grid. We actually have lots of cleaner burning technologies that we don't use at nighttime because demand goes down. So again, one of them is that California has a pretty good wind resource. It just doesn't happen to blow during the day very much. We have much better wind at night than during the day. California will not build as many wind farms as I would like unless nighttime wind power was of value. And it won't be of value because we use most of our electricity during the day. But it will be of value if you can plug in your hybrid car and charge it up at night when the wind is blowing better. Notice, however, this also opens the door for the N-word. All right? Because nuclear plants, which are running full out during the day, are underutilized at night. So nighttime charging up of your plug-in hybrids opens up a new opportunity for nuclear, which some people will like, some people won't like. Complicated.
All right, we have time for 2 more questions.
I'm just curious. It seems like as environmentalists we're a very contrarian bunch. And I'm always struck by the fact, if you read whatever blog XYZ on a day,
Right.
after the post when there's comments, there's always people tearing the post apart, which is great in some respects. But I think that's where people get a little perturbed with us. And it always seems like no matter what solution you come up with, hybrid, plug-in hybrid, there's always a guy in the back door going, hey, what about batteries?
Right.
So I was just wondering, I'm always interested for people scientists like yourself. Do you have a way that you prioritize the steps that need to be taken? What is of paramount importance?
Yes. So this is I think totally true. I've never seen a field that tears itself apart even before it does anything more than this. Environmentalists, like you're saying, you propose a plug-in hybrid which seems to solve this big carbon problem, which I personally regard as the bigger problem out there. And then someone says, well, but it's likely that half those owners are going to throw their batteries in a stream and you're going to kill fish, etc. It will happen to some extent. But we give a pass, a free ride to a lot of existing industries that are incredibly dirty. And we don't go down this road of tearing them to bits. Whereas, for whatever set of reasons, we tear up new innovations. Now, part of that is good because you don't want to give a new thing should have to pass a lot of tests. Skepticism is a virtue. You should test them, you should figure out, but it's amazing how many things, how much of the time we spend, sort of not, breaking down things that have a real chance to play a role here. So I don't know what balance we should have there, but I do know that the opportunity to green our economy is much larger than we think, but the same people coming up with the solutions are in fact also tearing them down. I actually think that part of the solution to that is something which is happening only now. 10 years ago, the number of environmentalists thinking about neat things we might do was reasonably high, but the number of environmentalists that knew any economics was very low. There's now a new wave of environmental researchers who actually know economics and evaluate new technologies in ways more similar to what goes on in the venture capital and the business world. Now that's healthy for a lot of reasons, but it also means that we are going to see the dirty side of new technologies come to the front more, because the fact that 1,000 kids are dying a year in this country from mercury from coal plants is true, but if 3 people die because a solar panel falls on them, that will get the news. Because we're used to those 1,000 kids dying from mercury poisoning, but the next accident when a truck carrying solar panels spills on the freeway and someone's crushing it, I guarantee you, that will be covered way out of proportion. So, I don't know the solution, but I do know that we're skewed, and I think part of it is getting these technologies more mainstream, where their warts and their good sides are more in the evaluated not just by science but by business. So it's a tough question.
So we have time for one last question. I'd love for that question to come from somebody that hasn't asked one tonight.
I'll ask one. If nobody else has one.
All right.
You haven't said anything about the possibility of clean coal burning plants. Is there such a thing?
A pig is a pig is a pig. You can dress it up.
I think you answered my question.
Yeah.
Can I ask really quickly?
Sure.
Well, I feel like I'm kind of afraid to ask because there's so many knowledgeable people here. But these natural gas cars, and well, I mean, what immediately comes to my mind is, isn't it dangerous? But I just don't know.
Yeah, it's not. It's a good question. It's not that dangerous. Gasoline is actually a more dangerous fuel than is natural gas. Gasoline is a more dangerous fuel than hydrogen. But natural gas cars that are being installed in California, San Francisco has them. You see the natural gas vehicles. East Bay Mud drives. Lots of people drive them. They're better than burning gasoline in your car, but they're not the solution. You know, if the whole world switched to natural gas tomorrow, if we had an infinite supply, which we don't, we wouldn't be anywhere near that 80% target we're talking about. So natural gas vehicles are better than what we're doing today, but they've got to be part of a transition down to the real low carbon things, which is sort of why this low carbon fuel standard and these targets that the governor's done, I think, are so critical to support. So I guess last plea, politicians are really good at one thing. Right? They're really good at sucking up to aggravated voters. That's what they do, right? This is the first time that environment has a chance to be not the 10th thing on a list of important topics, but a lead. Not as big as it's the economy stupid, but way up there. And this is the first time I think we're going to get all of the presidential candidates, irrespective of what you like and don't like across the board, they are all likely to have a pretty good environmental policies. Even the candidates that I could never vote for their positions on right to life and right to all kinds of things I won't even get into, all of them are pretty good on the environment. So what happens when all the candidates on one issue are reasonable? It means that to differentiate yourself, candidates have to actually be bold. Pushing all the candidates to be better on the environment and on energy means that all the candidates overall will egg each other on. And that means that even the minimum candidate's going to have to get on board. And the critical thing is that lots of candidates have said, oh, I'm very pro-environment. And it means that in the last year when they're lame duck, they'll pass some law. But if every candidate eggs themselves on because all of us tell them this is not the 10th order thing, this is the first, I want a good energy policy, I want a good environmental policy. If they do that, whatever they say they're going to do, they're all going to say, I pledged during my first 100 days to do X. That means it will happen. If they say, I'm pro-environment, but I'm going to solve the economy first, that means they do it when they're lame duck. They do it in the last quarter of their last term. But if they say first 100 days, it will happen, and this is the time. So I actually think that in terms of what to do, the biggest thing right now may be to get all of the political candidates to up the ante on energy and environment. Thanks a lot.
With that, let's thank Dan Hammond.
Thank you.
I really appreciate